presented at the press conference is lifted now. Now, new drugs and novel treatment regimens have the potential to improve long-term tolerability, reduce costs, and reduce the number of pills for people living with HIV, and especially the number of pills they have to manage every day. And today we're going to hear evidence on new drugs with new mechanisms of action and important data from a trial looking at dolutegravir and TAF in resource-limited settings. We've also updates from key studies with more data to challenge the 3-drug therapy and the daily dosing paradigms. Ultimately, the advances we're seeing in science are about giving people living with HIV more choices. So, our first speaker is Pedro Cahn, who's Scientific Director of the Fundacion Huesped in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and a past president of the IS. He's going to share 96-week results from the Gemini studies, which looks at people switching from a 3 to a 2-drug regimen for people starting treatment for the first time. Pedro, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's my pleasure to tell you something about the study we are going to present in a few minutes in the big room in the A hall. As you know, triple therapy has been the cornerstone of antiretroviral therapy for many years. We have been telling people that you need to take 3 drugs in order to suppress your viral replication, recover your CD4s, and prolong your life, avoiding opportunistic infections and other diseases. And this has been completely true until, I would say, probably 6 or 7 years ago. And since we started to see that some potent drugs could be in some way the anchor drugs combined with other antiretrovirals, providing the same results as 3 drugs. We did so with lopinavir, ritonavir, and 3TC in the Gardel study. We did so with darunavir, ritonavir, and 3TC in the Andes study. And then when the integrase era came across, and we saw a drug that had a very high genetic barrier and high potency like dolutegravir, we tested this hypothesis in a pilot study with 20 patients, the PADDLE study, and that showed that 90% of the patients were really undetectable very early after 8 weeks and remained so after 48 and later on 96 weeks. That was only a pilot study, 1 arm, so it was just a proof of concept. Afterwards, the ACTG group did the 53-53 trial in which they showed similar results in 120 patients and patients with viral loads up to 500,000 copies. Those 2 studies paved the way for the Gemini 1 and Gemini 2 studies that were presented for the first time in the Amsterdam conference last year in 2018, and in which we showed for the first time that an integrase inhibitor-based regimen in dual therapy in combination with 3TC was non-inferior to a triple drug regimen of dolutegravir, tenofovir, and FTC. But then when we presented the results, some people had the question, well, is this durable? Will this last for a longer period than 48 weeks? Will resistance come across as time goes by? The answer is no. For resistance, the answer is yes for maintaining this durable suppression. So now we can present the results and say that dual therapy based on dolutegravir 3TC has shown to be effective as triple drug therapy with non-inferiority was confirmed, and 0 resistance was selected either in the triple drug arm or in the dual drug arm. So I think that now is the opportunity, together with other studies that will be presented at the same conference, to rethink about the position of dual therapy in the international guidelines.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Now, our next speaker is Jean van Wyk, Global Medical Lead for dolutegravir at ViiV Healthcare, and Jean's going to share some data on a TAF-based regimen from the Tango study, which looks at switching to a 2-drug regimen amongst people who are already doing well on a 3-drug regimen. Sorry, I should have said dolutegravir.
Yes.
That's slip of the tongue for me. Not sorry, Jean.
Thank you, Anton. Yes, I'm the Global Medical Lead for dolutegravir at ViiV Healthcare. And at the late breaker session, I'll be presenting our results from the Tango trial, which is the primary 48-week outcomes from this study. So Pedro has already very eloquently told you about the rationale for doing these studies. The Gemini 1 and 2 trials looking at therapy-naive patients And in the Tango study, we're looking at patients that are virologically suppressed on a stable TAF-based regimen. And that can be a 3 or 4 drug regimen switching to a dolutegravir plus lamivudine 2-drug regimen. So I'll just add to the rationale. Of course, we know today when people are getting diagnosed with HIV, we expect them to go onto therapy as soon as possible and then to remain on it for a lifetime. And this can be decades, 40 years or longer, and that's why we believe it's imperative to look at reducing cumulative long-term antiretroviral exposure. So in Tango, I'll tell you a little bit about the design and then get to the results. In Tango, we looked at these patients on TAF-based regimens for at least 6 months with undetectable viral loads. As I mentioned, it could be 3 or 4 drug regimens. They could not have hepatitis B co-infection. And then they were either switched to dolutegravir plus lamivudine as a fixed-dose combination tablet or to remain on the TAF-based regimen. The primary endpoint in the switch studies is looking at virologic failure, and that was at week 48, which is what I'll be presenting. And what we found, in short, is that the dolutegravir plus lamivudine 2-drug regimen was non-inferior to the TAF-based 3 or 4 drug regimen, regardless of whether you looked at virologic failure as the primary endpoint or virologic success as a secondary endpoint. Another way of looking at these outcomes for virologic efficacy is to look at confirmed virologic withdrawals, which are subjects that have viral loads above 200 after a viral load above 50. And what we found for these CVWs in the dolutegravir plus lamivudine arm was that there were 0 patients at week 48. And as such, there were 0 patients that developed resistance in this trial on the 2-drug regimen arm. In the TAF-based arm, there was 1 patient. With regards to safety, there were similar outcomes between the 2 arms with regards to overall adverse events. But as expected in the switch study, we did see more treatment-related adverse events in the dolutegravir plus lamivudine arm. And that's because the majority of patients was switched to 2 new agents in the form of dolutegravir plus lamivudine, so it's completely expected. So in summary, these patients had non-inferior virologic outcomes over the first year of the trial. The trial will go up to 3 years, so we will get longer-term data as well. There were no CVWs with 0 resistance development. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean. So our next speaker is Roland Landman from BIchat Hospital in Paris, and he's going to discuss an ANRS study looking at quite a novel way of giving antiretrovirals, 4-day-a-week regimen. Roland, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Anton. So currently, 19% of HIV patients in France are undetectable in viral load. And the major issue is still improvement for these patients on convenience and tolerability and cost of antiretroviral therapy, which is still very, very high in our countries. So in recent years, different strategies to that in reducing 2-drug regimen or maybe reducing daily drug treatment dose, for example. There is another approach, is a short cycle approach. So here we are going to reduce the weekly amount of ARV. So we have some experience before on 2 days of treatment on efavirenz, for example, in photo studies or different kind of breather studies. And we have another experience of a 3-day regimen of 3 days of treatment in a previous trial, pilot trial, we call 4D INRS trial on 100 patients. But we designed the INRS Quatuor trial to investigate this kind of short cycle approach on treatment, whether the third agent will be PI, NNRTI, or integrase inhibitors. So the first part of Quatuor study is now completed, and we are going to share the results at 48 weeks. It's a randomized study, so we compare 318 patients on this 4 days approach with 3 days off to the standard of care of 7 days a week. At 48 weeks, the result shows that the 4 days a week treatment, whatever the third agent class, is as effective as a standard treatment with a 96% success rate. It's non-inferior, whatever the third agent class, on therapeutic success and also on therapeutic failure, in fact. So in conclusion, we believe that the new short cycle approach, this kind of approach, with 4 days on treatment and 3 consecutive days of treatment, offer patients and physicians a new therapeutic maintenance therapy option. We must also remember the large economic impact of this strategy. It's a 43% reduction in ERV intake and cost in our countries. In addition, maybe sometime we can include more patients accessing to HIV care in low-income countries too.
Thank you very much, Roland. So now I'm going to ask Francois Venter, who's a professor at Wits in Johannesburg, South Africa, to share data from the advanced trial. Some of you saw the weight gain data from that on Monday, and this trial looked at newer ARVs, dolutegravir and TAF, in resource-limited settings. And please, Francois, go ahead.
Thanks, Anton. So we studied 2 new agents, dolutegravir and TAF, which have been moved. The class of integrase inhibitors to which dolutegravir belongs has replaced NNRTIs in most richer countries, but poorer countries rely on this class of drugs, which have actually performed very, very well. In addition, we rely very heavily on a drug called tenofovir, which has its own side effect profile, and there's a safer version of this called TAF. Both dolutegravir and TAF have been licensed to generic manufacturers and are actually extremely cheap to make. So if we would have a safer, theoretically a safer and a cheaper regimen for first-line patients in the area of the world which is most affected by the epidemic. So what we did essentially was compare the efavirenz, which is the standard of care, to dolutegravir and TAF to tenofovir. And to cut a very long story short, the patients did really, really well on all 3 regimens, very similar to what we've seen with the registration studies done in richer countries. The virological suppression rates were superb. The side effect profile was really, really good, bar one, and that was the weight gain data, which Michelle presented in granular detail on Monday. I would suggest you go back and look at that. We saw, particularly in the TAF dolutegravir arm, but also in the tenofovir dolutegravir arm, significant weight gain, as an average of 10 kilograms of weight gain amongst women at 10 weeks. The only other area of the study which was surprising is that South Africa, where the study was conducted, has very high rates of resistance to efavirenz documented in the background. And despite that, the patients on efavirenz, almost all of them suppressed on the first-line regimen, signifying to me that just good adherence counseling actually can get past that. So in summary, we've demonstrated that all 3 regimens are very safe, very good, work effectively with the concern around the weight gain and what that means going forward. And we're hoping to extend the study to try and work out what that does mean.
Thanks, Francois. Now our final speaker is Jean-Michel Molina, who's a physician at the University of Paris and the Saint-Louis Hospital, and he's going to discuss a new drug from Merck and its 48-week data and its effectiveness. Thanks, Jean-Michel.
Thank you, Anton. Good morning, everyone. So it's a pleasure for me to present today data on a very new and exciting drug called islatravir. This is a drug from a new class of agent with a new mechanism of action called translocation inhibitor. So it blocks the reverse transcriptase and has a very potent activity against HIV-1 viruses, not only wild-type viruses, but also multi-resistant viruses. The other interesting feature of this drug is that it has a high IQ, inhibitory caution, at very low dose. So you give people tiny amount of drugs in the range of 1 milligram per day instead of a few hundreds milligram with other regular drugs. And another interesting attribute of this drug is its long half-life, more than 120 years for the intracellular half-life of the drug, which allows for once daily dosing, but potentially in the future also once weekly, potentially once monthly dosing. And you may have seen yesterday interesting data using this drug for prevention in an implant, which was able to provide enough drug for potentially a year. So the data I'm going to show today are data relative to a phase 2 dose ranging study in people naive to antiretrovirals that were started on a triple regimen for 24 weeks with different doses of islatravir plus doravirine, a new NNRTI, and free TC. And in the control arm, people were receiving a standard triple regimen of doravirine, tenofovir, and 3TC. Because it was a phase 2 study, only 30 participants per arm were enrolled, so it's a relatively small study. And what was interesting was that for those individuals who achieved the viral load undetectable at week 24 after the first 24 weeks of treatment, they were transitioned to a second phase where 3TC was removed so that people remain on a dual regimen of islatravir and doravirine to assess the potency and the safety of this dual combination in those individuals. And I will show today the 48 weeks data showing that in all 3 arms with islatravir, you achieve a very good response, very good safety that is actually comparable to the control arm. And so these are promising data that will encourage the company to move to a phase 3 trial to see how these results can be confirmed in a larger study set and also to assess the potency of this dual combination for maintenance therapy in the future, providing also novel options for people and with a drug that, again, has a high genetic barrier to resistance, so which efficacy seems to be quite interesting.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. And now we'll be happy to take your questions. If you've got a question, there are some microphones there. Please come to the microphone and then indicate your name and outlet. And please keep your questions relatively short. Okay, so please do.
Fred Scheich with IFAR TV. My question is for Roland. What led you to the 3 days on and or 4 days on and 3 days off? Is it because the naturalness of a week and specific days on and off, or is there any other reason you might?
No,
or
course,
have you looked at anything else?
No, the previous experience on ARV interruption was based on efavirenz with 2 days off. So we move on this direction with 3 days off for the weekend, because most of the patients ask for that, to stop the treatment during the weekend. That's one of the reasons. The other one is about maybe the mechanism. The mechanism is well based on the latency of viral rebound. So we know from previous studies that viral rebound is not going to appear during 3 days. It's maybe the mechanism of efficacy of what we saw. In fact, maybe it's a longer half-life of the drugs. Maybe it's the intracellular activity of the drugs. But okay, we choose that because we have previous experience of some virological escape for patients who try to take the drugs for 3 days a week or 2 days a week. So we made the point on 3 days off during the weekend.
Hi, Laura Vargas from Aptus Health. I was wondering if you are thinking of switching a therapy that's for lifelong, and you are just looking at more than 2-3 years, how can you be sure it's going to be comparable what you're measuring to 20 or 30 years, as you mentioned before? And this is for the two studies that are trying to reduce the number of medicines that people are taking.
Okay, Pedro and Jean, do you want to try and answer that?
Switching.
So.
Thank you for the question. So randomized clinical trials are designed per what we have in our regulations by the FDA and EMA and so on. Usually we have primary endpoints at week 48, and for the TANGO study specifically, we recognize that having durability data through 3 years would be important, but also potentially to see if there's differentiation between the 3 or 4 drug arm and the 2 drug arms. But you're right, that's why we have real-world data studies and cohort evaluations. Once a drug becomes marketed or gets authorization, we continuously evaluate the effectiveness and the safety once the drug is marketed through these mechanisms. And as we get more data with these 2 drug combinations in the real world, we'll publish those.
Pedro, what about being naive for the same reason? How do you know that's going to? I mean, you've gone out to 96 weeks. I suppose the question is, how long do you need to watch?
Well, the Gemini studies are planned to continue for 1 year more, and we are also looking at the data coming from real life cohorts. We will actively pursue that, but so far I can tell you that we have seen very similar results with other combinations, including 3DC, as I said. The point is that the drugs that we use, like lopinavir, ritonavir, are no longer preferred drugs because you have to take four pills a day with several side effects, etc. So it's not a kind of dark spot in a white blanket, you know. We have other experiences that dual therapy works, and we have heard even with new compounds, dual therapy seems to be moving forward in several areas. So we are pretty confident that this should work. And as I said yesterday in a presentation, we don't mean to say now everything should be dual therapy. We are going to wipe out all other options. I think we have another strong option for initiating therapy, and as Jan pointed out, probably also for switch therapy.
I mean, I'd like to ask each of you about those who developed virological failure in the studies, what resistance patterns you saw, because, you know, we do have this, there's been a report on global resistance from WHO this week that's been released, so we just need to know from all of you what the implications of these therapies are in terms of people who fail, have virological failure, and the resistance profiles.
In the different trials in which dolutegravir was used as first line in triple therapy, no patient showed any emergent resistant mutation. And in the Gemini trial, in which instead of using 3 drugs, we used 2, it was the same case. No patient emerged with resistance.
And we saw the same in the Tango study, and as I mentioned, there were actually 0 patients with virologic failure or confirmed virologic withdrawal. So there were 0 patients with resistance development. And I think it goes to show the high genetic barrier of dolutegravir remains intact when it's used as part of a 2-drug regimen or as part of a 3-drug regimen.
Roland, the virological failure?
I will say the same story because, in fact, we have virological failure in both arms, both also in triple regimen with 7 days a week. We have to remember that time to time we have virological failure. It's not 100% maintenance efficacy. And we have 6 virological failure in the 4 days a week arm and 4 in the 7 days arm. It's similar, totally similar. And of course, it happens in low genetic barriers drugs, on rilpivirine, for example. So, of course, we have the same risk of to use low genetic drugs, but we don't see any kind of viral resistance of dolutegravir, for example, or on PI.
Yeah. So before we carry on, I just wanted to ask you. So if you're going to 4 days a week, would you think that higher genetic barrier drugs would be a better choice so that to avoid resistance, or do you think that's another study?
It's another study because it was not built for each drug. It was built on the 3rd agent class. Okay, but in fact, well, everyone is going to move to high genetic barriers drug. I think so. So that's the point.
Francois, resistance?
Same story with dolutegravir. Over 700 patients, not a single patient developed dolutegravir resistance. I think what was interesting in the Favrin's arm is we had 16 virological failures, but even there, 9 of them resuppressed. So despite the WHO concern about resistance impact, most of those patients actually will suppress despite any RTI resistance. So I think there is a lesson for us that if Favrin's, and it's good news for us certainly, because we are going to need an alternative to dolutegravir in those patients who are gaining weight.
Jean-Michel, was the resistance studies done in the study for those people who may have developed virological failure?
That's a good question. Actually, in terms of virologic failure in the study, all virologic failures had very low viral load. The definition was above 50 and all were below 80 copies. So there was no way to detect resistance, and none of the sample was sent for genotypic resistant test.
Okay.
Potentially because of the attributes of the drug.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Hi, Emily Land from Beta and San Francisco AIDS Foundation. My question is about sort of the ideal patient to receive a dual therapy, so either to start on dual therapy or be switched. Are there any sort of like patient characteristics that you might look for?
Jean, you go first, and then
first.
over to Pedro.
Okay.
We'll switch to you.
The question is about the characteristics for the ideal patient.
And specifically adherence.
Okay. So in the Gemini studies, we included patients who were therapy naive. They could not have any resistance to major drug classes, so that is an important note. And specifically, if you have a resistance to dolutegravir or to lamivudine, this therapy would not be appropriate for a patient who is naive, so if they have transmitted drug resistance. In addition, patients who have hepatitis B cannot use this regimen due to the fact that lamivudine has some activity against hepatitis B and they might develop resistance. Other than that, therapy-naive patients clearly have the same virologic outcomes at least over 48 weeks, and we'll see at 96 weeks today, it's the same. And then with regards to switch patients, the population that we've looked at are patients, again, with that have never failed therapy before, who have undetectable viral loads and no resistance to either dolutegravir or lamivudine, and again, hepatitis B. So those are the main considerations for the patients. You asked about adherence. Adherence has not been measured very thoroughly in these trials, but there's no reason to believe that the adherence would be different between the 2-drug regimen arms and the 3-drug regimen arms, and the outcomes are the same.
Yeah, and just remind us in both trials the number of pills the patients had to take, because I mean, in reality, in naive trials, everybody wants a single pill, okay, and there are a lot of single pill regimens, and globally that's what they receive. So Pedro and Jean, maybe you could tell us what was actually given to the patients.
The patients had to, in the Gemini trial, had to take 2 pills because there was a double-blind randomized clinical trial. But in real life, they will take only 1 pill because there is a fixed dose combination that has already been approved by the FDA and by the IMEA, and is in his way to be approved in other countries as well.
In the Tango studies, we could not do double-blind because of the variety of the regimens that patients could be on the TAF-based arm. That at least probably 5 or 6 different types of medications. So they could have been on more than 1 tablet in the TAF-based regimen arm. They were on a single tablet in the dolutegravir 3TC arm.
And you don't think that may have affected the results?
Well, the results show equal outcomes really over time, so no.
Sorry, if you are not expecting a change in adherence, it's more a thing of costs? Changing the drug schedule would be more in saving money?
No, I think that since, as Jan pointed out, that antiretroviral therapy, as of today at least, is a lifetime endeavor for our patients. Why would you expose a patient to 3 drugs if you can do the job with 2? That's the main reason. It might have cost consideration, of course, because you are using less APIs, less active pharmaceutical ingredient when you don't need a 3rd drug. But the main reason is to reduce the number of chemical compounds you are providing a patient every single day of their lives. And some people acquire HIV infection, as you know. The epidemic is in young MSMs mainly, not only, but mainly. So that means that a boy of 18 might be taking drugs for the next 60 or 70 years. So if I can give him 2 drugs instead of 3, I'm more than happy.
And I have a question about the viral failures that were very low levels. If are very low levels that you cannot detect with regular techniques, does that not mean that in any case you have resistance, and at some point that virus can replicate and at some point get to higher levels and become a problem?
Jean-Michel?
Could you repeat the question or rephrase the question? Sorry.
I'll just say, so low-level viremia, does that not mean resistance is being developed and they may get virological failure at some stage?
Not all the time, depending on the threshold, and you have to appreciate that, very low viremia sometimes when you just repeat the test, it could be below detectable levels. So it depends what you mean by very low viremia, and we've seen a couple of times patients having low viremia. When they are retested, the viremia becomes undetectable. So really, that's why the threshold for the definition of failure might differ. And the WHO uses, or even in the US, the CTG uses a threshold of 200 copies per ml, because we know that above that threshold, it's probably really a failure. But when you have a very low viral load in the range of 50 copies or 50 to 100 copies, below 200, really you don't know what's going on, and the risk of resistance is very low here.
And
of course, you have to be cautious and monitor these patients just to make sure that the next viral load are below detection.
And those patients you had with 80 copies, did you repeat the viral load on those patients?
Well, they were all patients that actually had a viral load above 50, and which was confirmed with a second test, and both tests were all below 80 copies. And then afterwards, because they reach the definition of virologic failure in the study, they were discontinued. So you couldn't.
So we don't know.
So know whether a long-term treatment would do anything.
Pedro, you want to add something?
Yeah. Very briefly, at this conference, I don't know if you saw a poster in which the blips of the Gemini study were presented, and the percentage of patients presenting blips one or more were exactly the same in the in dual therapy arm versus the triple therapy arm. So it's not exactly virological failure, but blips might tell you something, and there was no difference between 2 and 3 drugs.
Right. Roland?
Yes, I want to add the same thing. In our strategy, we compare the blips, number of blips. It's totally equal, little bit more on 7 days a week compared to the 4 days a week.
A lot of blips are really related to laboratory issues rather than
it's not
the actual what's going on in the patients. Yeah. So I want to just look at this globally now. Dual drug therapy globally. Francois, maybe I'll ask you this. I mean, the hepatitis B issue in Africa, if we decided to go to that, and also about the data on dual therapy in, and I'm going to come to Jean really, because you're from ViiV, are you planning to do studies in pregnancy and tuberculosis, which really are benchmarks for approval, or at least for recommendations made by WHO? So Francois, about dual drug therapy and the hepatitis B issue in Africa.
So hepatitis B in my scenario in Johannesburg is about 7 or 8% of the adult within the HIV community, but it soars into the 30% in Zimbabwe, and places in Mozambique it's as high as 60, 70%. So, and those places, South Africa has a very established hepatitis B vaccination program, but those countries do not. So they're going to be stuck with hepatitis B for a very long time. Tenofovir and TAF as a single agent has very good anti-hepatitis B activity, which is why getting rid of those two agents in any regimen is very difficult for us. 3TC, unfortunately, by itself, there's eventually development of resistance in most cases if they stay on it long enough. So for us, it's a little bit more complex. The combination of dolutegravir and 3TC and some of the other agents that don't have hepatitis B activity is a very difficult thing to take on. Having said that, there may be significant cost reductions in this. That means that maybe screening for hepatitis B might be the way we have to go forward in the future. As well as Pedro says, being just exposed to less drug in over 30 or 40 or 50 years would probably be a good idea. So it's not off the table in resource-limited areas, it's just more complicated.
Jean, are you planning trials in tuberculosis and pregnancy with dual therapy?
We do not have active pregnancy trials ongoing for the dual therapy regimen, or sponsored trials looking specifically at pregnancy for dolutegravir in general. But it is a recognized data gap, and we continue to try and fill it through collaborative studies with external groups, as well as through cohort studies, which is not ideal, but that's how it works at the moment. The other one, pregnancy, tuberculosis. Yes, so we've done a number of trials for dolutegravir-based regimens, the 3-drug regimens, with rifampicin-based and rifapentin-based dolutegravir-based regimens. And for 2DRs, or for dolutegravir plus lamivudine specifically, it's a recognized data gap, and we will look at filling that again with collaborative studies.
Okay, thanks. Jean-Michel, is there any activity of the new drug against hepatitis B?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, the drug has no activity against hepatitis B, and that was an exclusion criteria, those who had chronic hepatitis B in the study.
Okay. Right. Is there anything the panel want to add before we close this, or anyone else from the audience? No? Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming to the press conference. I'd like to thank the panelists for their expositions and their answers. And I hope you have a really marvelous last day and enjoy the late breaker session. Thank you very much indeed.